And thanks very much, Hugo. That was actually really interesting. I don't come from a design background, and I'm always fascinated by the sort of design response to some of these things. They blow me away because it's something that is so far removed from the world that I exist in that I always find it fascinating to watch. So I enjoyed that very much. Thanks for that. I think it is the end of a long day, and we've had a lot to think about. And so my thoughts when I was listening to that presentation often floated back to some of the things we heard earlier today. So I'll try very briefly to maybe just some of my thoughts about your presentation and tie them to some of the other things we've heard today. One of the first things that you sort of showed us was that with our built form, it doesn't provide for diversity, as it is, and there's potentially two responses to that. One is to provide more of a blank canvas so people can customize it themselves, but the other was to actually have a much more deliberatively programmed response that people can then slot themselves into. And that reminded me a little bit of one of the tensions that we were hearing from Marla earlier today when we were talking about some of the open spaces in new housing estates. Historically, we've sort of gone for we'll just leave the blank canvas and let it sort itself out, which was sort of the Radburn approach, where it wasn't particularly well defined. And that didn't, that was not always successful, but now we sort of seem to go for the much more programmed approach with our public spaces, which is, well, it's the flavour of the month, but will that be more successful? I mean, we're sort of, in the way we respond to our particular housing form, seems to have a similar tension there, which is sort of just an open-ended question, I suppose, of how you resolve that. One of the other things you talked about, well, I suppose, is that this is very much an exercise in the built form in our housing stock, and it's arguably the problem is that it's divorced from the way we plan for our built form is divorced from the way we plan for the humans that occupy that space. And that reminded me a little bit of some of the stuff that Ruth was talking about. I mean, it came up in the questions, but it was also in your presentation, Ruth, which was very much about that social planning seems to be, for some reason or another, artificially divorced from built form planning. And I was in your presentation thinking, well, maybe that's the problem, that when we plan the built form, when we plan our housing stock and regulate for that, it seems to be divorced from the people that may occupy it now and in the future. And the third thing was quite interesting when you were sort of talking about some of the feedback you got, and you gave the example of the bathroom slab was it 50 mil out? And I was thinking, if I built a house, I would almost certainly get something more, at least 50 mil out. Probably my bathroom would be about a foot and a half out. But it was interesting that became a real point of contention, and it was really sort of minor. And I was actually thinking to something that I was talking about with the domes of the house, that they were so loathed by the population in Egypt, I think you said it was. And it got me thinking that, maybe what's going on here is these small things annoy us more because they're thrust upon us. Like, the dome was thrust upon that community in Egypt, and this bathroom was thrust upon the community. And so I was sort of thinking a little bit about, well, a dome can be good, a dome can be bad, but is it bad because it's being thrust upon us? And it's sort of, how to articulate this? I guess that the built form isn't necessarily good, the built form isn't necessarily bad, but it's so much driven by the context in which we find ourselves occupying it. And again, that sort of just goes back to, I guess, that tension between social planning and built form planning. Sorry, it's a little bit impressionistic. It's not particularly resolved thoughts. It's the end of a long day, but they're just some of the things I was thinking about as I was watching your presentation. So I'll just sort of leave it there. Say thank you very much.